Well, welcome back to these constant context videos where we've been exploring what does the Bible say, and then we've been going through the book of Genesis. And here we come upon Genesis 13, which reads, So Abram left Egypt and traveled north into the Negev, along with his wife and Lot and all they owned. Abram was very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. From the Negev they continued traveling by stages toward Bethel, and they pitched their tents between Bethel and Ai, where they had camped before. This was the same place where Abram had built the altar, and there he worshipped the Lord again. Lot, who was traveling with Abram, had also become very wealthy with flocks and sheep and goats, herds of cattle, and many tents. But the land could not support both Abram and Lot, with all their flocks and herds living so close together. So disputes broke out between the herdsmen of Abram and Lot. At that time, Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land. Finally, Abram said to Lot, Let's not allow this conflict to come between us or our herdsmen. After all, we are all close relatives. The whole countryside is open to you. Take your choice of any section of land you want, and we will separate. If you want the land to the left, then I'll take the land on the right. If you prefer the land on the right, then I'll go to the left. Now, as many of you know, I grew up in northeastern Colorado on a farm, and that farm was handed down from my great grandpa. And when he had handed the farm on to his sons, what would be my grandpa's generation, he divided the land up, and each one of them has kind of started their own family farm. And that's, of course, from my grandpa, is what my dad inherited. Now, my dad was fortunate to inherit land from both my grandpa's side of the family, but also my grandma's, both his dad and mom's side of the family. And so overall, our plot that has come down from my great grandpa is a little bit bigger than the rest of the family's plots that have, the extended family and what land they own. But when I was in Colorado, it was such a blessing to me to go and drive the farm as I sometimes do. And I actually took a left at a one T in the road where I should have took a right. And rather than going through the rest of my dad's farm, I ended up in different parts of the extended family's farm. So I was still seeing the last name Brophy all over. But I knew, that this belonged to this part of the family or this part belonged to that. It was amazing for me to see how similar of a way the land was divvied up, just as we see the land being divvied up between Abram and Lot here in Genesis 13. Now, while I have experienced good ways to go our separate ways, I've also seen it done incredibly poorly. When I was in middle school, there was a lawsuit that happened across extended family, and ultimately, some cousins of mine lost the land that they oversaw because they could no longer afford it, and the courts ended up taking them from them, and they lost their livelihood in doing that. And in many ways, there was a fallout because of the different blame game that happened in terms of whose fault was what and different things like that. And it just ended really poorly. And I think that type of fallout is more what we face when families encounter drama, or maybe when they go through change that requires something similar to how Abram and Lot needed to deal with the land, because of course their hired workers weren't getting along with each other. And in so doing, I am amazed at how many times you'll talk within families and family members are no longer talking to each other because of something the other had done, and a lot of times it has to do with our possessions. What's amazing to me about what we saw in the Tower of Babel a couple of weeks ago, the fallout in terms of how the people's languages were confused, that really informs how families have gone their separate ways over the years. That we are much more formed with the notion of we're going to take what's mine and go my own direction and appeal to property, possession, or my own selfish desires above and over relationships and family and continued interactions, continued loving dichotomy. It is so strange to me that we see in Genesis 13 the proper way to go our separate ways when the time comes, and when it's time to go our separate ways, to do so being incredibly generous with what is in front of us, while also blessing the other and sending them with that blessing. That is the design that we are given throughout Scripture, both in the Old and the New Testament. When I think about Paul going his different directions, parting ministry with other mission partners, and he does so with a blessing, understanding that God is calling that other partner elsewhere. But the reality is we are much more centered on possessions, on money, and we are very much centered on our own selfish ways. And so it's amazing, though. I was listening to a podcast about this actually just yesterday. That was a sermon that Francis Chan had given back in 2017. In that particular sermon, he's talking about the worship that we encounter in Revelation, and just how powerful it is in terms of every knee bowing and every tongue confessing that Jesus is Lord, and to worship him 24/7 in heaven. And Francis Chan pointed out, he said, can you imagine what it would be like, or can you even fathom someone stepping up and saying, what about this, what if they said that this is not how I worship? What if they said, oh, I'm not having this portion of the worship? I mean, Francis Chan says, can you even fathom what that would be like? He said, no, no one's going to do that, because they're so lost in worship. They're so lost in what God is doing in their midst that it doesn't matter how they're worshiping. The fact is that they are just enjoying God forever. And yet he points out that this is what happens when churches make certain decisions that people disagree with, is that we step back and we say, this somehow doesn't fit my need. I don't like this change. And ultimately, I'm not going to worship this particular way. And he said, and that just blows me away. And the reason that it blows me away actually goes back to my own history in this. In terms of at seminary, they always worship in a very liturgical fashion, very traditional fashion, a very high church fashion. And I just didn't get anything out of it. I'd grown up I really appreciated contemporary settings. And I just thought to myself, I'm not going to get anything out of this. It's just not my style. And so I went my separate way. I said, I'm not going to go into chapel anymore. And then, so I stopped. And it wasn't too long after that I mentioned this story to one of my peers, that I mentioned, I struggle with the way the chapel is set up, because it's just not the way that I worship. And one of my peers said to me, he's like, well, that's where you and I are different. She said, it doesn't really matter what style I'm going into. It doesn't really matter the type of worship that I'm interacting with. But if it's sincerely for the Lord, then I'm going to expect that the Lord is going to use that worship for his glory to then speak into my life. In other words, she said, I expect God to be present and to interact, and I am looking forward to having that interaction. And I was just so convicted by that I was so willing to go my separate ways, that I was unwilling to see how God could use a different way of speaking to me to speak his truth, to interact with me in a way that I didn't even expect. I mean, with the case of Abel and Lot, Abram and Lot, we see that there's a sincere trust that the Lord is going to provide for both Abram and Lot, much like Jesus says, God takes care of the birds and the bees, I'm sure he will definitely take care of you too. I think with Abram and Lot, there is such a sincere trust and such a sincere understanding that God is going to fulfill all their needs, that it doesn't matter to them whether they go to the right or the left part of the land. Both of them are going to be fruitful because God wants to use that particular area for their blessing. So even when they realize what they're doing together is not working, they still have a full understanding that God is going to speak and God is going to supply. And I wonder if something similar is true about when we face changes in our life and when we maybe interact with, if something goes a different direction than we might want or that we might expect or we might hope for, and then we think to ourselves that God is somehow not big enough to speak through this particular situation, so we're going to go our separate ways, assuming that that's the only way that God is going to provide. I think, though, that that's a limited imagination of who God is. To understand that God is able to provide in any situation, is able to speak through every situation, and ultimately to interact with us so that we can enjoy his blessing, enjoy his just incredible graciousness in our lives, and what might the church look like instead of constantly looking to part ways. We would be open to how God is going to provide in such a time as this, with the other realization that if it comes to a place of where we do need to go our separate ways, I mean, if it really comes down to doctrinal issues that really are backbone portions of the faith, that we can no longer go and say we can no longer move forward in this, what would it look like to be a blessing, to be gracious in the way that we go our separate ways? Because, of course, we get the biblical example of going our separate ways, but so often we leave each other with a curse and with holding on to our possessions in the meantime, rather than trusting God through the process. I hope that as we continue to go through this video series, that these videos continue to be a blessing. But I also hope that as you interact with this series and these videos, that you would feel free to ask any questions. A lot of times I'm looking from one week to the next of like, how can I interact? What does my time look like? How can I bless the people of this congregation? And sometimes when I'm just speaking to a screen, that's kind of strange. But so I'd love to hear feedback. I'd love to get questions. I'd love to have follow-up conversations over any portions of these videos, or even if they bring up a thought that I haven't thought of. Love to talk to you about that as well. I pray that you would be blessed this week. Keep in mind that this weekend is our chili cook-off on Saturday. Definitely take a moment and come and try some chili, or if you have the time to come help set up or tear down, we could certainly use the help. But I am so excited about the missional opportunity that we have through the chili cook-off. And so I pray that one way or another, you'd have the time and find the time to join us this weekend. We'll see you soon. Until then, God bless.